of Beatrix Potter Treasury. The Tale of Peter Rabbit, 1902. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in the sand bank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dear," said the old Mrs. Rabbit, "one morning you may go down into the fields or down the lane, but do not go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there, and he was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going to go out." Then the old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood loft. To the bakery, he saw a loaf of brown bread and 5 colored buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, ran down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden, and he squeezed under the gate. First he ate some lettuce, and then some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. And then, feeling rather sick, went to look for some parsley. But around the end of a cucumber frame, who should meet but Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor was on his hands and his knees planting out young cabbages, but he jumped and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop thief!" Peter was most dreadful, frightened. He rushed all over the garden, and he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes amongst the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs and ran faster, so that I think he might have gone away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry near and got caught by a large button on his jacket. It was Blue Jacket with brace buttons quite new. Peter gave himself for a loss and shed big tears, but his scarves were overhead by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in the great excitement and implored him exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sleeve which intended to pop upon the top of Peter, but Peter wriggled just out in time, leaving his jacket behind him. And he rushed into the tool shed and jumped into the can, who it would have been beautiful things to hide if he had not so much water in it. Mr. McGregor, who was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath the flower pot, he began turning them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Achoo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time, and he tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of the window, upsetting 3 plants in the window, was too small for Mr. McGregor. As he was tired of running after Peter, he went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with a fright, and he had no of the least idea which way to go. Also, he very damn with sitting in a can. After a time, he began to wander about, going to Liberty, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked and there was no room for 5 little rabbits to squeeze underneath. An old mouse who was running in and out of the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the woods. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only spoke with her head, and Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to the pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very still, but now and then the tip of her tail stretched as her if was alive. Peter thought the best to go without speaking to her, and he had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards to the tool shed, but suddenly, quiet close to him, he heard a noise of a horse scratch. Scratch, scratch. Peter squished underneath the bushes, but presently, had nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow, and he peeped over. The first thing he saw, which was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight, walking behind some light currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him and called Peter, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe, at least in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice and soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. He wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in the fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of his Peter 1 tablespoonful to be taken to bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. The tale of the Benjamin Body. To be continued.